Good morning, friends. It's Keith again, and Christian. And today we're going to read a story. The story we're going to read is Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, I have a question for all of you out there. Do you know how many dwarfs there are?
Count, please.
We are going to count. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 dwarfs. No, we don't have 8. We have 7 dwarfs. Now, does anyone remember what the 7 dwarfs are? What's their names? We have Bashful. We have Sneezy. We have Doc. We have Grumpy. We have Happy. We have Dopey. And we have Sleepy.
I read, please.
We are going to read.
I read, please. I read. Just a read story.
We are going to read a story. Are we ready?
What?
One snowy night in a castle far, far away, a princess was born. Her parents named her Snow White. As the years passed, the child grew up to be a loving young woman. Her beauty and her gentleness and nature won all the hearts of all who she knew. After Snow White's father died, she lived in a castle with her stepmother, the Queen. The Queen was very beautiful, but she was cold and heartless. She was also jealous of Snow White's beauty. So, she dressed the princess in rags and forced her to work as a maid. The Queen's most possession was her magic mirror. Every day, she stood in front of it and asked, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And every day, the mirror would reply, "You, O Queen, are the fairest in the land." While the Queen spent most of her time admiring herself in her mirror, Snow White worked long hours in the castle. She always did her chores with a smile, often singing while she worked. One day, she drew water from the well. She sang a song about her fondest dream. She wished a handsome prince would come to the castle and carry her away.
Go away?
Go away, I know. "Please, with all my wishes come true," whispered Snow White. No sooner had she said the words than a handsome prince appeared next to her. Snow White gazed shyly into the prince's eyes. The prince fell in love instantly, but Snow White suddenly became frightened and fled for safety of the castle. That evening, as usual, the Queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But this time the mirror replied, "Her lips blood red, her hair like night, her skin like snow, her name is Snow White." Uh-oh. Uh-oh. The Queen was so furious she immediately called for her huntsman. "Tomorrow take Snow White deep into the forest and kill her." Then she gave the huntsman a jeweled box and told him to bring back proof that he had obeyed her order. The huntsman feared the evil Queen and promised to do as she wished. The next morning, the huntsman took Snow White into the forest. He watched as the princess stopped and placed a baby bird back in its nest. At that moment, the huntsman knew he could never harm this kind-hearted girl. He fell to his knees and begged her forgiveness. "My dear princess," he asked, "you are not safe. The Queen is jealous. She has ordered me to kill you, but I can never hurt you. Quickly, he added, run into the forest and never return. Snow White was frightened by his words and did as she was told. She ran and ran until she could run no farther. Lost and alone, she sank to the ground and sobbed herself to sleep. The huntsman placed an animal's heart inside the box for the queen and presented it to her. The evil woman rejoiced, for she believed the huntsman had carried out her order. "Now I'm the fairest of them all," she exclaimed triumphantly. When she woke the next morning, Snow White found herself surrounded by forest animals. Curious birds, rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks, and even a mother deer and her fawn creeped up close behind her. Snow White laughed. She didn't feel alone any longer. "Do you know of a place of where I can stay?" Snow White asked the woodland friends. In response, two birds creeped excitedly and began to tug gently at her cape. Snow White followed her new friends to a tiny cottage nestled along the trees. "Oh, it's just like a dollhouse!" Snow White exclaimed. Since no one seemed to be at home, Snow White stepped inside. "Oh my, what a terrible mess!" she cried. She stared in wonder at the 7 little chairs. 7 children must live here. "I'll just tidy it up a bit and surprise them. Perhaps they will let me stay for a while." Snow White began to clean the cottage. The animals helped her and swept the dust and washed and scrubbed. Soon the cottage was neat and tidy. Snow White went upstairs, where she found 7 little beds lined in a row. Each one had a name carved on it. "What funny names for children," remarked Snow White, as she read the names aloud. Happy, Dopey, Grumpy, Sneezy, Bashful, Doc, and Sleepy. Then she yawned. "I'm a little sleepy myself," she added. Snow White laid across the tiny beds and promptly fell asleep. Meanwhile, 7 little dwarfs were hurrying home from a hard day's work at the diamond mine. They didn't know, but they had a surprise waiting for them. For these were the 7 dwarfs who Snow White had fallen asleep. They sang merrily as they walked in the forest. Doc led the way with the lantern. Behind him were Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Sneezy, Bashful, and at last of all, Dopey. As they neared the house, the dwarfs noticed something was different. The windows were clean. Cautiously, they crept inside. Everything was neat and tidy. "Just as I thought," cried Doc. "Someone's been here." "Maybe it's a goblin," said Bashful. "And maybe it's still here." "Only one way to find out," said Grumpy. So up the stairs they went. But instead of a goblin, the dwarfs found Snow White sleeping on their beds. "It's a girl," declared Doc. "She's beautiful," said Happy. Snow White was awakened by their voices. "Oh!" she cried when she saw them. "Why, you're not little children at all. You're little men." "That's right," said Doc. "But who are you?" Snow White introduced herself and told them all about the wicked queen. "You can stay with us," said Doc. "We won't let anything happen to you." All of the dwarves agreed. But back at the castle, the queen once again consulted her magic mirror. But the mirror replied, "Over the 7 jeweled hills, beyond the 7th falls, in the cottage of the 7 dwarves, dwells Snow White, fairest of them all." The queen was outraged. That huntsman, he lied," she shouted, knocking the jewel box to the ground. "Now I'll have to take care of it myself." The queen ran down the stairs to a dark dungeon room where she kept an assortment of enchanted powders and bubbling liquids. She quickly mixed herself a magic potion. When she drank the potion, she instantly turned into an ugly woman. Then she cast a magic spell on a luscious red apple. One bite of this poison apple and Snow White will fall asleep forever. White will sleep forever, she crackled in glee. That night, at the cottage where Snow White cooked a special meal for the dwarfs. Supper's almost ready, she told them. You'll just have time to wash. Wash, said the dwarf. They had almost forgotten what the word meant, but Snow White was firm. So they all went outside to scrub themselves clean. Even Grumpy got soaked. After dinner, it was time for some fun. The dwarfs played their musical instruments and took turns dancing with Snow White. Dopey climbed on Sneezy's shoulders and covered them both with a long coat. Now he was as tall as Snow White. But not for long. One sneeze from Sneezy sent them both tumbling to the floor. Before they set off for work the next morning, Snow White gave each dwarf a goodbye kiss. Beware of strangers, warned Doc. No telling what the wicked queen might do. Don't worry, replied Snow White. I'll be careful. After the dwarfs left, Snow White began making pies. All alone, my pet? She heard someone ask. Snow White turned around and saw an old woman at the window. How would you like to taste one of my nice apples? They're wishing apples, you know, the old woman said. They do look good, replied Snow White. The animals recognized the queen at once. Snow White didn't. Snow White took the apple and made a wish. As soon as she bit into the apple, she fell to the floor. Only love's first kiss could awake the sleeping princess. Ha ha ha! Crackled the queen. Now, my pretty princess, you will sleep forever. The animals hurried to the mine. They tugged at the dwarf's clothing until the little man understood that something was terribly wrong. The dwarfs jumped onto the deer and headed for the cottage. On their way, they spotted the old woman and recognized the queen in her disguise. Follow her, Grumpy shouted. So they chased her all the way up a steep cliff. The queen reached the top of the cliff and was trapped on a narrow ledge. She was about to push a huge boulder onto the dwarfs when a bolt of lightning struck down on the ledge. With a horrible scream, she fell to the jagged rocks below. The wicked queen was gone forever. When the dwarfs finally arrived at home, they found Snow White asleep on the floor. Nothing they could do would wake her from her sleep. With tears in their eyes, they gently laid Snow White on the bed. The next day, the dwarfs built a golden casket for Snow White. It was covered with glass so they could always see her. Then they carried the casket to a peaceful glen in the depths of the forest, where the tall pine trees carpeted the ground with their fragrant needles. For many days the dwarfs stayed by Snow White's side, hoping she would awake. But Snow White slept on and on. Meanwhile, the lonely prince had been searching for Snow White far and wide. One day, he heard of a beautiful maiden who slept in a golden casket deep into the forest, surrounded by 7 little men. Finally, he came upon Snow White. He lifted the heavy glass lid. My beautiful Snow White, at last I found you, he whispered. Then he kissed the sleeping princess. Snow White opened her eyes. The spell was broken. The prince gathered Snow White in his arms and lifted her onto the horse. This time Snow White was not afraid of the handsome prince. Goodbye, she called out to the dwarfs. Now you have been good, kind friends. I will never forget you. Snow White kept her promise. She included the dwarves in all the festivities in the castle, where she and the princess lived happily ever after. The end. Thank you for listening, all my friends. I miss you guys, and I hope to be talking to you soon. I do have a craft that I will be showing. It's going to be a Mother's Day craft. Hopefully you enjoy it. And thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye.